time for us to check back in with the family history and stories of Opal Corn Myers. If you missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And also, that very first line of the description is where you can purchase the book, and also where you can visit the author, Barbara League's website, and find out more about her. Charlie and Mary Pack, Mill and Store. There were all kinds of mills up and down the creek. Charlie and Aunt Mary Pack, Papa's older sister, owned the mill and store at the foot of the hill at Mount Zion Cemetery. They owned all that land up around there. The store and Mary's house were right where the Church of God in the name of Jesus is now. The mill was down behind the store on the other side of the creek, farther away from their house than Acorn's is from mine. He also owned land on Sand Hill. Then there's a footnote. Larry Corn Myers, that's Acorn, I guess, 11/11/55. Opal's son converted Opal's barn into a house where he lived until it burned down. The fire occurred after Opal's death, destroying all the pictures, Bibles, and personal possessions remaining of Opal's. The county owned the land above Uncle Charlie's, next to Mount Zion Cemetery, where Ebenezer Church now stands. At that time, however, there was a little public school there called Mount Zion, like the cemetery, which also doubled as a church, a Baptist church. That was the first public school that was in this way, but I don't know when it was built. I know for sure it was there when I was 4 or 5 years old. Ebenezer Mission School had been here for maybe 10 years before the public school came. Uncle Charlie would get so upset with the boys from that school because they would throw rocks at his pumpkins and do things to destroy his crops. Many years later, he finally made an arrangement with the county. He traded the land that the school was located on for a good piece of his land up on Sand Hill so they could build a new school, one far away from his crops. Mama seemed to be sick a lot, but sometimes on days when she felt better, we would walk to Mary's store. Mama liked Mary, and we did too, because she would give us crackers and a big old handful of brown sugar that we would wad up into a hard little lump and eat like it was candy. The crackers back then didn't come in family-sized packages, but in great big boxes. Mary would sell them either by the pound or a few at a time. The store was a place people would come to socialize. There was a stove right in the middle of the store. On days when the weather was bad, the men would gather at the store. They would sit around that stove, chewing their tobacco and spitting in the ashes while they told their big tales and played checkers. That's about all the pleasure they had and all the pleasure they needed, it seemed. Mary was always good about helping people. Many times people would come in the middle of the night needing something, maybe because of a sick child or wife. Mary would get up and go over to the store to get the medicine or supplies, whatever they needed. She was never cross with them, but instead encouraged them while she slipped a little piece of candy or two down into the bag to surprise the children with. She was a nice woman. One time we went down there, we saw Aunt Mary and some others sitting out in the yard with a baby that didn't have any clothes on. I thought that was just awful for that baby to be out there with nothing on but a diaper. We started up towards the house to walk to her, but she said, "Don't be coming up here too close. This youngin's a-burning up with the fever. Think she must have the diphtheria or something like that." I don't remember ever hearing tell who that family was or if the baby got well. People were always coming to Mary for medical advice about what they should do or take for certain ailments. Aunt Mary, what a hard-working woman. She'd do it all, even when she was at the store by herself. She might be grinding corn down at the mill when a customer would come to the store and holler for her to come wait on them. She'd say, "You have to wait till I get this turn ground." She'd finish the turn, shut the mill off, and go help them. One time when we were down there visiting Mary, she said, I've got some of the best tasting, prettiest Irish taters you ever laid your eyes on. Let me dish you some up." She reached down into that barrel and pulled out a plate of big Irish potatoes. "They just don't come no prettier or whiter than these uns. Don't matter if you bake 'em or boil 'em whole, they taste mighty good." They were good, all right. I thought since she pulled them out of that barrel, she had preserved them, sort of like we dried or pickled food and put it in barrels. Like the early pioneers, the mountain people didn't have cupboards, so they used to keep their food inside whiskey barrels or big nail kegs, which were easy to come by. Pickled beans and corn were commonly preserved that way. With big families, there was no place to store all that inside the cabins. Most times they were put along with other food crops into the storage buildings. When we got home, I exclaimed, "Mama, we need to fix us up a big old barrel of them taters like Aunt Mary had. They were so good." I was surprised by her reply. Aunt Mary didn't have no barrel full. She'd just cooked 'em up and put 'em down in that barrel so she could cover 'em up and keep the flies off till the next meal. I can still remember her giving us those big potatoes. You had a great family, Lori, always caring about people and giving of themselves. That was my Aunt Mary. Wish you could have known her. Living by Grandma Corn, 1917 to 1918. I'd have to say it was good living so close to Grandma and Grandpa Corn. Well, I guess there were some times we young'uns had second thoughts about that, though. You see, Aunt Florrie was tall and big like Papa, and with her and Grandma always there, it was like having a couple of extra mamas around. And believe me, they treated us just like they thought they were our mama. If they saw us doing something wrong or just thought we needed correcting, they didn't hesitate a bit to get a hickory switch and whip us. That was the kind of family we were raised up in. It was like one big family, and you respected your elders whether you liked it or not. Yes, sir, you showed respect, and if you were wise, you learned that lesson quickly. My grandma had definitely been one who was able to instill strong values in her children, not only of showing respect, but the values of sharing what you have, hospitality, and a giving of oneself. Grandma was a person that didn't get mad or yell or anything like that, but when she spoke, you just knew. You had it in you somehow to know that you had better mind her. She wasn't the type of person to argue with, and yet she wasn't overly strict either. I don't know what it was about her. Maybe it was just that we were in such awe of her. I can recall when we would come into the house from playing and have sand on our feet, and she would say, "Look at your feet now." To us, it was as good as if she had whipped us. We knew to get out and get that dirt off of our feet before we came back into the house. It was just a rough old floor, nothing special at all, but it was important to Grandma, so we cleaned our feet. Suzanne Angeline Corn, my grandma, was warm and gentle, even in her strictness. When I was young, I loved my Grandma Corn more than just about anybody. I always wanted to be just like her. She was Dutch, only about 5'3", around my height, but she was a lot bigger than I am. She was short and fat. She always wore a red or blue kerchief over her head, which she tied under her chin. On Sunday, she wore a white one. I don't know why. I don't know if it was just the way she was brought up or what. That's why I guess I've always worn a cap. I grew up thinking you had to. And then I remember the mission people reading that part in the Bible, you know, where it says not to pray with your head uncovered. Guess that's where I got that idea, and I've always worn something on my head. I hardly ever go without a hat. After every meal, Grandma would go back in the chimney corner to smoke her pipe. It was one of those corncob pipes they used to make. She had a certain rock on the fireplace chimney that jutted out farther than the others, where she kept her pipe and that strong homemade tobacco of hers. That was the only time she would touch her pipe, 3 times a day after every meal. Grandma Corn loved to talk about everything. She'd tell us tales about the Civil War and her family and all sorts of things. I'd have given anything if I could have grown up around her and really have gotten to know her in other ways too. But then by the time I was in school and old enough to do things like that, she was sick. She died May 10th, 1928, when I was away at school. Grandma's stories. Grandma had many wonderful and incredible memories of the past. She would eagerly gather us up in her arms and tell us as much as we wanted to hear about how things once were. Most of the people we knew growing up did not like to talk about the history of their families. Maybe there was too many things they didn't want known. Many were too preoccupied with the hardships of the present day to want to remember times that were even worse. Oh, but not my grandma. She built within us a love and acceptance of our heritage, kind of like what I want to do for you, Lori. Isn't it amazing how some people, no matter how much bad happens to them, no matter how difficult the situations life seems to hand them, can come out on the other side even stronger? That's how my grandma was. I have two favorite stories that Grandma would tell. One about Grandma during the Civil War, and the other one is about John Peter Corn and the feisty redhead. So this next part of the book, the story I'm going to read first, the Civil War story, it's kind of difficult to hear. So if you're not interested in hearing some of the atrocities that her grandmother witnessed in the Civil War, you should just skip through this part all the way to the end. That's what the rest of the reading will be about, or just join us next Friday. I just want to let you know that. So if you're not, everything Opal shared is just really wonderful and uplifting and interesting, hearing about her grandma and her grandpa. But I know some people don't want to hear about bad parts of life. So this is definitely a very bad part of life for her family. So if you're sensitive to that, you might want to skip all the way to the end where I'm talking about my thoughts, or just join us next week. Civil War. In 1863, when my grandma was 8, her life was no different than any other mountain child. She lived with her family in a small one-room log cabin with a half loft and a board lean-to kitchen attached to the back. She and her sister Mandy worked hard helping in the fields, toting water, and caring for Jacob Abel, their brother, who was only 1. In the evenings, Grandma would clear the table, put the food scraps into the slop pail, which stayed in the corner by the lean-to door, and carefully cover it with the rough-cut board. She put the dirty dishes into the large pan of water that had been heating on top of the wood-burning cook stove since some time before dinner. After drying the last dish, she shook out the cloth and used it to cover the leftover food on the table to keep the flies off. Lately, there seemed to be more leftovers than usual, but she had also noticed that in the mornings, most of them had disappeared. She first thought that her papa had eaten before he went out to do the morning chores, but Papa had been gone a lot overnight lately, and she knew her mama never ate before breakfast. For as long as she could remember, there had always been some spaces between the boards in their kitchen, but recently a new hole had appeared in the wall just above the crudely made table. Maybe that old coon had been swiping food through that hole. That thought rested lightly on her mind, causing her to be only mildly curious. After completing her normal chores that evening, Suzanne helped her mama stack some kindling next to the cook stove. Hearing a noise, she spun around, fully expecting to see that pesky old coon. Instead, it was a man's hand, large and hairy, feeling its way across the table in search of the leftovers. She was about to scream, but before she could work up half a sound, her mama grabbed her from the back and placed a hand very firmly over her mouth. She looked into her mama's eyes. There was no fear there, only a look that said, "Young'un, you had best not make a sound." They stood there quietly, and her mama loosened her grip. That hairy hand continued its search across the table, finding the jar of milk and the stack of biscuits. Recently, everything around the community was different somehow. All the grown-ups seemed to be sharing a big terrible secret that the children were not allowed to question. Polly Ann, my great-grandma, would stand at the kitchen window just watching, sometimes for an hour or so during the middle of the day. You see, my grandma didn't know that her mama was anxiously waiting for the neighbor man, who was a rebel scout, to signal her. This was the clique's grandfather when he was just a young man. When she saw him wave his big old white hat from behind a tree, she would put on her apron and, holding up the bottom corners, would fill it with big cakes of cornbread, onions, sometimes a jar of honey or molasses, along with whatever else might be around. Then she would head out through the back door toward the pig pen, calling, "Here, pig, pig! Here, hog!" One day my grandma asked her, "Why are you feeding those hogs all that good stuff?" Polly Ann told her to hush. Her mama was afraid those Yankees would come through here, and she didn't want Grandma telling what was going on. She had heard stories, and she was scared to death that the Yankees would kill her and her family for what she was doing, but what else could she do? After all, it was her husband and neighbors who were scouting for the rebels. Mary Webb Turner's grandma. Mary Webb Turner, who lived across the ridge to the east of us, was closer to Maggie's age. Her grandmother also had a husband who was a scout for the rebels. There were several times when she would cook and carry baskets of food up the mountain to feed her husband and a few of the soldiers. On one occasion, one of the soldiers came to her house early in the morning and told her to get out every kettle she had and start cooking up a whole mess of food because there was going to be a crowd at her house for dinner. Sure enough, right at dinner time, they came riding in on their horses. Those soldiers had no regard whatsoever for other people's property or hard work. They raided the barn of hay and threw corn out of the corn crib onto the ground so their horses could eat their fill. It didn't bother them a bit to waste all that hay and corn. After the soldiers left, Mary's grandma went out and picked up all the corn kernels that were left trampled on the ground so that she could have it ground into meal. It's a wonder they made it through the rest of the year with even some food to eat. Those were hard times for sure. Another time, a man she didn't even know came running into her house. He pushed her out of his way as he told her there was a bunch of Yankees on his trail and he needed a place to hide. How he ever got in there without them seeing him, she never knew. It wasn't but a moment after that man had crawled all the way back under her bed that two of those soldiers came into the cabin. One sat down on the bed and the other asked as he glanced around the room, "Did you see a man running by here in the last few minutes? You haven't had any company recently, have you?" "Nope, I reckon not." The quilt on the bed went all the way down to the floor, but she was terrified, afraid that man would make a move, or sneeze, or cough, or that those Yankees would turn that bed up and find him hiding there. She knew that if the Yankees discovered his hiding place, they would kill her and him both. When she was sure the Yankees had left, she started screaming at the man, "You get out of this house and don't ever come back." She had good reason to be afraid. She had heard the stories. Some of the people she knew, like the family that the soldiers came upon as they were moving to a new place. Those soldiers stopped them and threw everything off the wagon, took what they wanted, and destroyed the rest. No one in the family dared to even open their mouths. They knew what would happen if they did. Some other soldiers, or maybe the same ones, I don't know, had dragged a husband and a wife out of their home and locked their children inside. Then they set the house on fire and made the parents stand outside and listen to their children scream and watch their house burn down and collapse on their children. Then they killed the parents. Whether they were making them pay for something they had done to help the rebels or just trying to get information out of them was unknown. They had threatened to do the same to a man who lived just over the ridge. They forced him to scout out the farms in the area for food, especially meat. They had told him if he didn't, before they killed him, they would lock his family in the house and set it on fire while he watched. He knew they had done that to a family he had known for years, and he knew they would do it to him. He was able to make arrangements for his wife and children to be moved to North Carolina, and as soon as he received word they were safe, he disappeared. Everyone had always hoped that he had run off and made it safely to his kinfolks. There's a footnote at the bottom of this page that says, Most of the atrocities during the Civil War were perpetuated by bands of marauding bushwhackers who had no allegiance to either the Yankees or rebels. This could be true of Opal's stories of the Civil War, and I'm sure it is probably. With all these stories going around of what the Yankees were doing, soon everyone knew, even the children. And when that soldier got killed just over the other side of Sand Hill in that log house that sat right out there in a field, everyone was afraid of what the Yankees might do and made plans for protecting their children and food supplies. Polly Ann sent Mandy and the baby Jacob to live with this woman who lived 2 ridges over and away back in the hollow. It was so far back in there that hardly anybody could find it. The Yankees come to Grandma's cabin. Polly Ann had warned my grandma about the soldiers. If you see any of them Yankee soldiers coming, I want you to hide. If you're in the house, you crawl as far back under the bed as you can, and don't you be making a sound or even move until I tell you. Do you understand what I'm a-saying? Not even if they come in here and kill me, you don't come out from under that bed. Her mama was still sneaking food to the scouts, and my grandma worried about the soldiers coming. What if the soldiers found out? What if they found out her papa was a scout? Then one day the soldiers did come, 4 of them. Polly Ann and my grandma were both inside fixing dinner when they heard the horses gallop up to the cabin and stop. Grandma immediately got under the bed. She laid on the old dark quilt that had been spread out on the floor for just such an occasion, and grabbing the outside edge, she rolled over, putting her face against the wall. With the dim lighting of the small cabin, they wouldn't even see her if someone looked under the bed. As long as she didn't move, didn't make a sound, she'd be safe. Before those soldiers had time to come to the door, Polly Ann went outside to see what they wanted. My grandma couldn't hear what they were saying, but in a few minutes she heard the door open and her mama was telling them they could have the food she just cooked. One of the soldiers asked if she had any more meat. "This here is all I've cooked." "Go out to the smokehouse and see what's there," he instructed one of his men. "You here by yourself? Where's your husband?" Suzanne couldn't tell what was happening. It sounded like the men had started to fight with her mama. Polly Ann would say, "Stop, you take your hands off of me. Stop, you're ripping my dress." Then she started to cry and scream. Polly Ann only had 2 dresses, and my grandma knew that her mama would be very upset if they ruined one of them. Polly Ann was terrified. She had heard too many stories of what the soldiers did to the community women. Some had been raped and beaten and then railed. She knew one woman they had taken outside to the rail fence naked after they had all had their way with her. They had forced her to sit on the ground, putting her feet through the space on the top of the bottom rail, and then put a heavy rail on top of them. They tied her hands together with one end of the rope and pulled the long end of the rope up and fastened it around the top rail of the fence, pulling her arms up as high as they would go, and placed 2 big rails on top, trapping her arms so that her bottom barely touched the ground. There was no one there to help her, and she died an agonizing death. Others had died too. She thought that maybe if they did that to her, she would be fortunate enough to escape death. She had Grandma there. As much as she didn't want her young'un to see her like that, she took comfort in that knowledge. She tried to keep her mind off of what was happening to her. One man was holding her down, pulling and tearing at her clothes. Then they took turns. There was a shot fired somewhere out back. I guess it scared her so bad that it gave her the extra strength she needed to get one of her hands free. She scratched one of the soldiers as hard as she could across the face, making deep gashes there. Being marked like that made him really angry. He cussed at her something awful and then hit her in the face with his fist, knocking her out. Grandma heard them go out on the porch where they met the soldier who had gone out to the smokehouse. She could hear the soldier telling them, "I got all the meat there was and tied it on the horses. Got us a bonus, too. That scout we've been looking for was hiding right there in the smokehouse. That's one less rebel we'll have to track down." Hearing that scared Grandma near to death, but still she didn't move. It had been quiet in the house, and it had been some time since the men left. She didn't know why her mama hadn't told her to come out. Then she heard her mama moan and the sounds of her pulling herself up in the chair. She groaned again and then called for Grandma. Grandma was glad to come out from under the bed. "Polly Ann, they found a scout in the smokehouse. They shot him. I heard them shoot him." You don't suppose it was Papa, do you?" Suzanne noticed Polly Ann's red, swollen jaw. "Oh, they hurt you. And your dress. They tore your dress all up." "I'm going to be fine. Now go look outside and be sure they're gone." Grandma had heard the horses leave, and she was sure the Yankees were no longer around. She headed to the smokehouse to see how much of their meat had been taken, and as she ran down the path, she tripped over the stick the soldier had hit the Scout with. She fell to her knees, and she lifted her head and saw him. The soldier had hit him with a stick that was used to prop against the smokehouse door to hold it closed, and his head had hit a rock where it had fallen, just to the right of the path in the potato patch. The soldier then shot him in the back. Grandma stared at him in horror. It wasn't her papa. She had never seen him before. His eyes open and staring back at her, yet seeing nothing, and blood trickled out of his nose. They buried him in an unmarked grave in the cemetery up on Persimmon Hill. He was the third person to be buried there. The first grave was that of a little girl who lived just down the road from the cemetery. After the little girl died of typhoid fever, her sister was heartbroken and in endless grief. She would hardly eat a bite, and her parents found her many times just sitting on the ground by her sister's grave. She would sit there for hours at a time grieving. She soon became ill herself with the fever and also died. She was buried there next to her sister. Nobody else knows who the Scout was or exactly where his grave is, but I do. Grandma told me about that so many times, I know exactly where it is. They buried him by those two little girls in the corner of the cemetery, and I could point it out to you today, even though those 3 graves are unmarked. I've always believed that the Scout my great-grandma buried was my great-grandpa Hall because they were never able to locate him after the war. They claimed the Yankees took him to Chattanooga and put him in a prison camp. Even after chasing rumors and checking Civil War records in Washington and Tennessee, his family could never find any record of him being buried, nor did they have any records of him at the prison camp in Chattanooga. It's been a long time since that war was over, but there are still reminders right around here. The house where the Yankee soldier was killed being one of them. Why, to this very day it's still called the Yankee House, and for all those years no one would live in that house. Lawton finally bought it. He even put down a new floor to cover those blood stains that wouldn't come out. It was a good house, but his family would never live there. Instead, he built that modest house up there in the hollow. Can you imagine living in that tiny house when they could have been living in that nice one? Morgan's raiders would come through here going to and from the train stop over at Whitmore, which was later called West Myers. If you took this path out from my house through the woods all the way to the river, you would come to the place where the troops got on the train. Of course, now there's nothing here to show that any of it ever existed, except the name Morgan Gap and, of course, Morgan Branch right out here by my house. I'm glad I didn't live back then. It was a pitiful time to live. How Suzanne Toby Corn could live through all that she did, bringing up all those children, and still be such a happy person, I just don't know. We'll stop right there. And that was the end of the Civil War part. A terrible, terrible time indeed. I do like the little footnote that Barbara added. I think that's true, that there was a lot of people during that time that were just raiders, and they had no allegiance to either side. They were just terrible people going around hurting people and tearing up stuff and killing people, and just a terrible, terrible time. And you may think, well, why in the world did she put, why put those terrible things in there? Why put them in there? Well, because that was her family history. And I think for Lori, she was really trying to make the point Opal was, how much she loved her grandmother, Corn. She just loved her. And she was, she's told us over and over, she was just the happiest person. And she was just wonderful. And she wanted to be just like her when she grew up. So I think she's trying to show, not only was she just a happy person, she had ample reason, like she could have dwelt on all that terrible stuff that happened the rest of her life. A lot of people do that. And, something terrible happens and they dwell on it the rest of their lives. But she overcome all that somehow, which I would say probably as a believer with her faith in God. And then she went on to raise a big brood of kids and grandkids and be happy and be part of the community and all that. So I think she's just trying to give Lori a true feel like she wanted her to know, really, she was this the best grandpa. She was just great. And look what she had been through, and she still chose to be great. So I think that's why Opal made sure to put that in there. And I had a really good friend. He's passed away now, and also part of my family. But he was really, really into genealogy, And he would tell me stories, of course, that he'd discover about how our family connected, but he'd tell me stories about his family too. And he told me one time, just teasingly, of course, but he said, every family has stories that they, like she says, some people wouldn't talk about it, Opal said, because maybe they had too many things they didn't want known. So every family has those things in them, all of them, every family does. But the teasing part is he would say that when he did pass away, he'd instructed his daughter to publish it all, because then nobody couldn't come after him, because we all want to kind of act like our families never did anything wrong back in the past. So he was just joking, of course, but he said then after that, when I'm gone, they can't come after me, but she could publish all the things I found out about. Anyway, so I think that was why Opal, it was really part of her family history, and she wanted Lori to know that not only was her grandmother really happy and warm and kind and she loved her, but also she was a very tough person that had survived all that. So that was interesting but hard to hear too, I know. At the very beginning, the other little footnote she shares is about the fire, which Opal was done and passed away then, was already gone, but that her son, who had all of her stuff, then he was living in a barn, had been converted to a house, but it burnt down, and all of Opal's things were gone then. They lost them all. That is so sad. I'm so fortunate to have never had anything like that happen to me. In Pap's family, they had a house fire when he first got out of the Marines. He was out of the Marines. It was actually here in Wilson Holler, but even further at the mouth of the holler. There's no house there now, but that's where it was at. And they were there. It was at night, and it was probably started in the kitchen. It was one of those houses that was like the dog trot between, so two different little houses connected, and it probably started in the kitchen, but it just went so fast that they couldn't get the stuff out. So like all of Pap's Marine things, like his uniform and pair of boots that he'd brought back, and his medals and things like that, they all burned up. They were gone. And the way of families, kind of like what Opal's describing, but when you have those big families, I remember one of Pap's aunts, she's really closer to his age though, because she was one of the younger kids, where his mother was one of the older kids in the family. But anyway, she told me one time that all of her stuff, like her high school, kind of thinking about like pictures and high school stuff, because she had once lived there, that her stuff was still there, and so she lost all of it too. So it's really sad when that happens. And I know a lot of you have shared with me, or not a lot, but several of you have shared with me that you had house fires where you lost everything. So that's kind of sad, and it just makes me really, really thankful that Barbara had all the recordings and all the writings from Opal, so that she could have eventually have made this wonderful book for us. So that's wonderful. Didn't you love Mary, the lady that run the store? Wasn't she just the kindest? How she would give them the crackers and ball up the brown sugar, and that's just like what kids would do. I don't know if you've ever done that with light bread. We would ball it up into a ball and then eat it because it's gummy, but she would give them the brown sugar and the crackers, and then she'd give them the potatoes that Opal thought, well, that must mean you can or preserve potatoes like that. She didn't realize she'd just put them down in there. And then how she did with the community, how she always, no matter what time of night, she would get up and go to the store and get whatever somebody needed, especially, thinking about sick children, and then she'd put a little bit of candy in there for them. Such a dear person, you can tell from that. And I like, of course, we've heard in all the books we've read, and then just general knowledge is in those days, I would say that was the two places to socialize, would have been the store, or maybe three, store, and usually there was gristmill and store kind of combined usually, but where you went to get your corn ground, that would have been a place. But then church, I was going to say church and store would have been the places for you to socialize. So I really like that. And I like that Grandma Corn how she wore the kerchief over her head, and Opal's saying that she just always did, and she had the two she wore during the week, but then she wore a white one on Sunday for church. And it does make you wonder if that was just the style of where she come from, if maybe her mother wore one. Styles like that change, of course. Now, a lot of people that watch my daughter's channel, Katie and Corey's, the Presley girls, or even when they show up in mine, they ask often a question we get is, why do they wear things on their head? Is that a religious thing? No, it's not, because it's nothing to do with their religion. They just started doing that at a really young age, I think, because they liked the way it looked, and then also they both would tell you then it's easy. You don't have to fix your hair because you just put a kerchief over it, a bandana. So that's interesting. And I love that Opal says that she continued that tradition. And remember, I remember if that's last week or the week before, she told us that the only handiwork that she continued to do was once a year she would make herself a crocheted hat. And to keep her skills, keep where she knew how to do that stitch. So I'm sure that crocheted hat is probably what she said she went on, and she just started wearing a hat. So I'm sure that was why. So I hope you enjoyed this part today. If you made it all the way to the end, if you didn't, if you skipped over that part, I totally understand. I totally get that. I totally understand. But I also understand why Opal wanted to be honest and share her real family history, but also I think she was really trying to show Grandma Corn, really give Lori an insight into why she loved her, that she was just this really strong, kind, loving woman, but also had been through all that stuff, but still somehow managed to do that. So please leave a comment and let me know what jumped out at you from today's reading, and I hope you'll drop back by next Friday so we can see what happens with Opal next.